because he was sort of a big tall guy with a moustache and farmer, and that he wasn't really the sort of person you pictured to have a sausage dog. He sort of proudly carried her around everywhere he went, whether it was to a discussion group on another farm, he'd take her with him, whether it was into town and he'd walk down the street with her under his arm, and he just didn't care that she wasn't, a big manly dog, I suppose. He loved it a bits regardless, and he didn't care if he got shit from his mates because he just thought she was awesome.
Hello, I'm Mitchell Jordan, and you're listening to Love is a Doxy. In this episode, we're off to New Zealand, which is particularly exciting as it's my first time to feature a guest from this beautiful country. And that guest is Harriet Bremner, whom you just heard speaking about her partner James, who tragically passed away from a farming accident in 2017, and their dachshund Poppy, who's since become something of a star in New Zealand. Together, Harriet and Poppy are doing some very important work in James's legacy. Harriet's tale is one of hope and healing, but to me, it is ultimately a love story. It's about finding the love of your life and figuring out how to go on when you lose them. And it's about the unconditional love that our dogs, in this case dachshunds, give to us. Harriet's love of dachshunds began when she was studying teaching and living in the South Island in Christchurch with her grandmother, who owned one of her own named Rusty. Fast forward to when Harriet and James had met, were living together on a farm, and had lost their pet Jack Russell, who died from a heart attack. James was adamant he didn't want another dog, though Harriet was by now thinking of bringing a dachshund into their lives, even if she was warned against it by some.
A few of our friends said, gosh, you can't get one of those, it's not a farm dog and all the rest of it. Anyway, I got told I could look at a puppy in a litter that I'd found. And so my mum actually went and saw the puppies initially because I lived too far away. Then the next time I was up in Christchurch, mum and I snuck away to a saddle fitting for my horse. And on our way home, I went and picked up a 6-week-old sausage dog puppy who was Poppy. And I told James to meet me in the paddock and help me unload my horse. And when he arrived in the paddock, I handed him this little sausage dog that was smaller than his hand.
Despite his initial apprehension, James soon warmed to Poppy. How could he not? Trying to resist the love of a dachshund is futile. No matter how strong you might think you are, it's nothing compared to the spell that they cast on you in seconds.
He was like, what is this? Anyway, by that night, the first trip home was in the plane, our wee Cessna that James flew. By that night, I've got a photo actually of him on the living room floor with Poppy licking his face. So yeah, it was sort of love at first sight, I suppose, even though he questioned why I bought a sausage dog to live in the hecker.
But as it turned out, Poppy pretty quickly proved her worth as a farm dog and showed the others who was boss.
I was going down the road to teach at a rural school, which was about a half an hour drive away. So Poppy spent her days on the farm with James. She went absolutely everywhere with him, and because the hecker can be a really cold place in the winter, she spent most of her time up his farm jersey with her head poking out the top. He just used to cruise around with his jersey tucked in with the sausage dog sleeping inside it, basically. And yeah, they did everything together. And yeah, he would legitimately come and get her to go and help him load lambs onto a truck or to move some cows. So yeah, she was pretty handy when she needed to be. So she was our only pet dog, but our family on the farm, we all shared our sheepdogs as well. But Poppy was in charge of every single one of them.
Although Poppy had grown close to James, that didn't mean Harriet was going to let him have her all to himself.
Any spare minute I got, I stole her, and we never used to argue, but in the weekends, if we were not doing the same thing, like if I was doing some work at home and James was out in the farm, he'd ask if he could come and get Pops to take her out moving cattle or something, and then I'd say, oh, but it's my turn to have Poppy. So I don't think she had a favourite out of either of us, but I think that because James was the one outside on the farm and I was going to school every day, she definitely thought he was the one that did more fun stuff.
See, as I told you, this is a love story. Both Harriet and James fell for their dachshund, and those feelings were reciprocated. But Harriet and James's relationship was just as strong. They'd first met back when she was 18, and it was an encounter which made a real impression.
I first met James at student races my first year out of school, actually. He was leaning against a Hilux with his cowboy boots on and a cowboy hat, chewing on a piece of grass, and he winked at me, actually, which was quite funny. Yeah, and so I just always remember that moment, I guess. Although that's, it's a long time ago when I was 18, I suppose. From then on in, yeah, it was just, we never looked back from there, really.
So to lose James in a farming accident after almost 1 decade together is a tragedy that no words can convey. After his passing, Harriet would find out that her soulmate had been planning a big surprise for her.
After James passed away, Dad told me that James had asked Dad if he could marry me on Christmas Day, which was, I suppose, about 3 weeks, nearly 4 weeks earlier, and James had told him what he was going to do and things, so yeah, he nearly got there, but not quite.
Sometimes our loss is so great and all-consuming that we forget others are also suffering. And by others, I mean animals. Harriet had lost her great love, but so had Poppy. And one day Harriet realised just how much her dog was grieving.
It gave me a real appreciation for what animals are aware of. Even though I've been around them my whole life, I suppose, had never noticed actually how much they understand. And we got up one morning and she just started barking at me. And in this high-pitched, squealy, desperate cry. And I'm not kidding when I say she barked at me for 8 hours solid all day. And I, in the end, rang my grief counsellor and was like, I don't know what to do. Poppy's lost the plot. And she went, oh, honey, she's grieving. And I kind of thought, oh my God, seriously, that can't be a thing. And then I sort of looked at Poppy's face and thought about her behaviour over that time and just the desperate, she wouldn't let me pick her up, but she wanted on me. She didn't want to eat. I couldn't do anything with her that day. She just let it all out. She actually was on homeopathic remedies for a while, which really helped. It was pretty intense, and every time somebody shut a door outside or someone came in, she went running over. And I remember the house being full of people, and she just walked around to everybody's feet and looked up at them. It was like she was looking for them. So it was pretty heartbreaking stuff, to be fair.
Harriet eventually understood that just as her life had changed suddenly, she also needed to make some changes. The first was to do something she had always loved. So after longing to write, that's exactly what she did, creating a children's book, Bob and Pops. Bob had been James's nickname, while Pops, well, I think you can figure out who that character might be.
We were en route to doing more farming together and things, which was my dream too. But yeah, I suppose teaching was never a dream of mine. I just did it because we lived up a gully and it was a good off-farm job to have, and I ended up loving the kids and things. My dream was actually to be a writer and to be on farms. Yeah, I kind of got brave and gave that a whirl. Anyway, it just suddenly dawned on me what a cracking story, the true friendship between a southern man and his miniature dachshund, and an unlikely one at that. So 10 minutes later, I scribbled out the draft of Bob and Pops and shot down the valley to a friend of mine who's an artist and said, I've just written this. Do you want to have a crack at being an illustrator? And yeah, with tears in her eyes, she gave me a hug and said, yep, let's do this. The other thing for me about releasing the story was I made it a memorial book because I found people were so awkward about talking about it. No one would talk to me about him. If I tried bringing him up, people shut the conversation down. They talked to me about the weather. They did everything to avoid it. And I thought, bugger this, we've got to get better at talking about these things and we can't just pretend like he was never here. And so I thought that putting him in a book was quite a sneaky way of all his friends and family, reading the story with nieces and nephews and cousins and children, whoever. And they're actually telling these children about this really amazing person that used to be around.
Harriet might have made some changes and followed her dream, even going on to publish a second book and educate the country about farm safety. But she soon found herself back teaching and not dealing with her grief for James properly. Until one day.
In terms of grief, I tried to run away from my grief for, 2.5 years, I think. One of my friends told me that I didn't cry for a whole year at one point. I don't even remember, to be fair. But I definitely, because of society not being open to talking about grief and trauma and things, I shut it down and tried to hide it away and pretend like I was all right. For me, that came to head about 2.5 years in, and I completely broke down, basically, in my classroom before school one morning. Literally got pulled up off my knees, and from that moment on really decided to turn things around and look on the positive, try and find some positives in life.
One of these positives is the joy that each day with Poppy gives her.
She's my shining light, I suppose, as cheesy as that sounds. She's my most important thing in the whole world, apart from the people in my life, obviously. I think the whole thing about dogs is that, especially dachshunds, because they don't like to be away from you, even if you have had a shower or something and you get out, they're still just so stoked to see you. Poppy does this funny little bum wiggle when she wags her tail. She's a bit like a Labrador. Her whole bum wiggles when she wags her tail, and she just, I don't know, just the fact that they just love you unconditionally is just pretty heartwarming, isn't it?
Now, with a third book under her belt and a podcast of her own in the works, Harriet's been busy travelling around the country talking about mental health and farm safety. She's often accompanied by Poppy, who knows how to command an audience's attention.
I've actually just been speaking at some conferences, and 2 of them that I didn't have to fly to, I took Poppy with me, and so she waltzed in through the sliding doors of the big hotel and sitting up on stage while I did my presentation. So she pretty much goes everywhere with me, and I actually had some feedback and people emailing me saying that even though they'd never met James, that they think he would be proud of me, and I think it kind of dawned on me last week that I was actually also proud of myself as well.
For anyone who might be grieving the loss of a person or an animal, Harriet has the following message.
I mean, grief is one of those things that's extremely different for every single person that goes through it. And I'm a big believer in the fact that no one's is any worse or better than anyone else's because it's yours. And we can't compare it, our experience to someone else's. It definitely destroyed my life at that time, and it's really hard to find words to describe how bad it is, because I think even for someone to imagine how bad it could be is still not touching the sides on how horrific it really is. If you combine a trauma with grief as well, that just adds a whole nother layer to it. So, I've battled with PTSD and flashbacks and all sorts of things since, plus, restarting my life. And I guess for me, I had been with him my whole adult life, so it was sort of, how do I move forward from here being an adult without him when I didn't know any different? But grief, in terms of the stages and things, I don't know. I feel like summed up, sometimes you can go through all the stages in a day, it feels like. So I don't know. I've never really followed the whole grief stage thing, because I think you just go through what you're feeling on any given day, depending on what's happening in life around you as well.
Sometimes, in order to make sense of the world, it's easy to fall back on well-worn sayings. The old one that everything happens for a reason isn't something that Harriet can agree with. How could she? But there is a part of her that knows Poppy was always meant to be in her life.
I don't believe that everything happens for a reason. People say that. I'm not a believer in that. Some things are just plain unfair and shouldn't happen. But I do think some things are meant to be. I actually said to my partner the other day, I said, I don't know how, there'll never be another Poppy, So everyone that meets Poppy wants a dachshund after they meet her, and she's just so unique.
Harriet feels grateful to her grandmother for instilling in her a love of dachshunds that's since spread to her relatives.
Yeah, so that's really how it started. All thanks to my grandma, and now Mum and Dad have one of Poppy's puppies, and my auntie has one. Yeah, so there's more sausage dogs than people in our family, I think.
And for those who can't have a descendant of Poppy, know that she's on the pages of a children's book somewhere, or maybe even coming to a talk near you. Love is a Doxy is created and written by Mitchell Jordan. To get in contact, send an email to loveisadoxy@gmail.com.